AliCamp 2024. Jaunita George, Holding Vendors Accountable, Designing Your Own Accessibility Vendor Monitoring Program. AliCamp 2024 is brought to you by our gold sponsors Intopia and ANZ, silver sponsor Canva, and Auslan sponsor SignHow.
Hello. Okay, I'm just going to repeat all of that because you probably didn't hear it. So on the screen is a QR code, and if that doesn't work for you, the link to the presentation deck, which is in PDF, just for accessibility purposes, please tell me if it's not accessible, is https://bit.ly/vendor A11Y2. And so I'll give you all a moment to get those slides. And I'll go back so you can actually get those slides. Going once, going twice, and designing your own vendor monitoring program. So first, we're going to start off by talking a little bit about Navy Federal and our commitment. So we are committed to providing financial services to all of our members, no matter where they're coming from. And so that means equal access, and that's core to our mission. You already have heard about me, so I'm going to skip this slide. However, just know if you can't see me and if physical descriptions are interesting, I am a tall woman, blonde, I'm wearing glasses, and I'm wearing a long flowy dress that has 1960s San Francisco vibes. This is my team. They are excellent, the best in the business. Please don't steal them. And there's a lot of content on these slides. We might not get to all the content. The reason why all of my so-called speaker notes are in the slides is because I want you to use them. I want you to use everything that's in this presentation. If you want a longer form of the presentation, you can go on my LinkedIn. It's right there. And honestly, if you even just take the presentation, take my name off, and put yours on, that's perfectly fine with me. Go create a good program. I just recommend you swap out the picture unless you want to buy a blonde wig. It's your choice. And note that the opinions expressed in this presentation are mine and mine alone and not those of Navy Federal. Also, I'm a lawyer, and I have to say this is not legal advice. And nothing in this presentation creates an attorney-client relationship. Also, the only advice I'm going to give you is that advice from an American attorney is probably not going to help you anyways. Different laws. Now, how to build your program. So there are numerous steps to building your own accessibility program. They include assembling your team, forming those relationships that will help you actually get the information you need to build credibility within your organization, determining the scope. We have a handy decision tree that's coming later on that you can share with your procurement partners. Inventorying your applications, which is a long process. I'm going to give you some tips on how to do that. Creating an accessible procurement policy. Writing accessibility contract language. Developing a robust process, which I'll share later. Including people with disabilities in that process. And outlining and making clear the role of the accessibility team. So for your accessibility team, you should have three, possibly more roles. A relationship manager to manage the relationship of the vendors and relationships with your team members within the organization. So that's the person that's going to be helping, do the contract negotiation, helping with, ensuring that the business units are getting their needs met, and sort of helping move along those vendors to compliance. Then you have your contract manager. That's going to be the person who takes care of the documentation, helps get the actual things like the RFP questions and such, all in place for you. Then you have the accessibility engineers. Those are the people who are going to be doing your smoke testing, your full testing of applications, and generally carry the expertise that your vendors will likely be relying on throughout this process. What you shouldn't do is look for one person who can do everything. They don't exist. So, also, you need to determine your program scope. This decision tree can be shared with your procurement partners to kind of help educate them about what it means to have things that fall under the scope of an accessibility program. This could apply to internal or external applications. It really just depends on what your leadership is going to allow you to do and what you have bandwidth to do. Now, if you have bandwidth to do more and your leadership hasn't quite approved it, you can probably still do it. But you have to actually figure out what the highest priority items are. Usually that's customer facing. So things like portals, that's something that a lot of people forget. Portals that are accessed by employees or accessed by your customers are very important. Web pages, digital documents is something that people tend to forget. E-learning content is another thing. If you're giving e-learning to customers, for example, that needs to be accessible. Also, if you're including employee-facing applications as part of your scope, it is definitely an area where there's more risk because everybody has to take required training. Communication tools like messenger applications or conference platforms, people tend to forget conference platforms. Surveys, another area. Emails, people don't think that don't understand that emails need to be accessible. They do, and there are good ways to ensure that. Native mobile applications, any feature that will be used on these, videos, designs, even services where a developer creates services that will be used in any of those things. There should be an accessibility provision that requires that those people have the requisite training and skills to produce accessible content, and their content should be checked. And so then you inventory your applications, and that's going to, for a large organization, it's likely that there isn't a good set vendor list, and you're going to have to likely create that yourself. And so it's important to know all of those vendors that are public-facing at first, and then employee-facing later, to ensure that to assess their current accessibility. So relationships in this process are really important to helping you connect those dots. And so, as I mentioned earlier, build a database of vendors. So you can use something like Microsoft Power Applications actually have I think it's called, I've forgotten at this point. But anyways, you can use Excel, but there's now a new Microsoft Office application that actually does this very well, and you can integrate it with other Microsoft applications. And I think this is their task list. But you can actually have the last accessibility audit date and results, documentation of accessibility fixes, so where they are in that remediation, their ACR if that's useful, and if it's available, the internal point of contact. And then public information, such as links to the thing that you have purchased from them for testing later. And then note the kind of vendor it is, because different kinds of vendors will require different kinds of contract provisions. Some may provide functionality, and some may provide services to create content. And then work with teams already inventorying vendors for other reasons. So you might have a governance team that's trying to do the same thing. Your procurement teams are trying to probably find all the vendors. And so you can make partnerships with those other teams to kind of help you grow that list, and you can all help each other. That will help you build credibility within your organization, especially if you have information to provide to them. Another way to do that is also email managers and such and ask them which vendors they use, because that's a really good way to actually just build out that list, because it's likely that they're using vendors that your procurement teams don't even know about because they have purchase cards, and it's the Wild West. So provide ways for different teams across the organization to report vendors and ask for accessibility reviews. So you can create a ticketing process where a team member across the organization can report a vendor to you, and then you can actually build an integration with that to your defect management system that you're using, and have another team member on your accessibility team kind of help triage that and add it to your list. Other ways to find vendors include searching for just Googling your organization and then searching and then seeing what comes up and seeing if there's a vendor name within those URLs. You can inspect the code to see if there are vendor applications being used. There's sometimes you can actually just tell by looking at when you do inspect. You can shadow teams to learn more about the vendors that they use in their content creation process. You can also build relationships with folks in procurement and ask them as well. Another thing is if there is a procurement tool that's used by your organization, like VenMinder or what have you, if you can get access to that, then you can get access to all their contracts. And then I would recommend that you build your own repository and know who they are. Also, you'll want to create a policy around this that states your organization's commitment to accessibility, their level of conformance, relevant law by consulting your attorneys, link to supplier code of conduct. Everybody should have a supplier code of conduct because those help set the tone with your relationships with vendors. Also, you can include an accessibility provision within that, kind of outlining your commitment to accessibility there as well, and it's public facing. It's a great document for kind of setting the floor for those relations. You'll want to define scope in that policy. Responsible team or party that will give power to your team to help within the procurement process, so folks don't ask, what is this person doing here? Also, outline how remediation and monitoring will happen, consequences for failure to adhere to the policy, which is very important because then you can actually include your partners and such if you have to do breach and termination. And of course, an exceptions process, and make sure to include the fact that exceptions are temporary and should be in a very short duration. So contract provisions for accessibility should state the level of conformance required, when testing will be performed and by whom. Try to shift those costs to the vendor as much as possible and have them provide you with the reports or some progress reports, as much as information as they're willing to give you, because that will help your program scale and keep it scalable. And then also how testing will be performed. That's going to be very important. You'll want to require that your vendors use a reputable independent third party. And the reason being is you'll want to be able to trust the veracity of any audits that are performed on behalf of your vendor if you aren't using your own team or your own vendor for that purpose. Permitting testing by your own accessibility team. So even if they're doing testing, you should still be doing smoke testing as part of your monitoring process. And we'll go over a little bit about what that is in a few minutes. Details about accessibility efforts by the vendor, response to remediation and remediation to issues found, as well as indemnification and breach information. So the accessibility team plays, actually, it should play a great role in procurement because your procurement partners can't necessarily cover, it's very much like security. They can't cover everything. They're not going to have the in-depth technical expertise, and they're going to need help throughout the whole procurement process to ensure that you're getting the information you need about the vendor and that you're actually monitoring them effectively and understanding and have a clear escalation path in the case of breach and such. So the accessibility team should be right there at the source, helping you secure accessible vendors. So reviewing and drafting accessibility requirements, reviewing VPATs and ACRs, performing pre-selection reviews, etc. So here's an overview of a process that you can implement in your organization. So you have accessibility really built into the requirements that the business unit creates when they're looking for a vendor to procure. The request for proposal, there should be accessibility questions baked into that process, and there should be a review of the accessibility of vendors at that point. Verification that the vendors are, in fact, as accessible as they say. Then contract with the most accessible vendor that meets your business unit's needs. Then you have monitoring and renewal. And so understand the team procuring the technology understands the importance of accessibility, and that's where you should have the accessibility team informed about the new vendor requests so that they can kind of get in at the ground floor and help you select a accessible vendor. Voluntary product accessibility templates, or VPATs, are basically it's a blank template that allows vendors to assert their level of compliance with WCAG. The veracity of those is often called into question. I would not rely on those. And a completed one of those is called an accessibility conformance report, an ACR. Again, we generally you don't want to accept those unless they're created by an independent, reputable third party. It's clear that everything is fully supports and it was based off of a recent audit with all defects fixed. And we just went over some of those reviewing vendor claims. Now, they have to be based off of a full audit of the product. Make sure that the functionality you're purchasing has been was part of that audit and that the testers that you're looking at are qualified. And a vendor should not be considered fully compliant unless, all findings were fixed or there were no findings. So smoke testing is a good way to make sure that your vendors are either in compliance if you haven't reviewed them before, just generally. They indicate whether or not you need to have a full audit, or if your vendors need to, or if there's actually some catastrophic failures on the actual vendor page. So a smoke test includes things like screen reader tests, keyboard testing, color contrast checks. It's a time-boxed review of critical functionality, and just allows you to understand the accessibility of the general accessibility level of that product. So if you're reviewing a bunch of vendors that provide the same functionality, that will kind of help you rate which one is more accessible than the other without a full audit. So I'm going to skip this because we're almost at time. So when you're working with vendors, it's important to have clear communication, and it's important to try to, come from a place of understanding. Vendors generally want to do the right thing, and sometimes you'll actually have to just figure out the structure of that organization and really do your research. So you have to be right on the technical aspects, but also you have to understand if this is an organization with a lot of products and a lot of product teams, who has an accessibility team who can help make the case for you and help push the product teams in the right direction, or if it's an organization that's a little bit more nimble. So always be reasonable and solutions oriented. And create a monitoring plan. So after you've assessed the compliance and level and such, and if the audits find defects and such, and you've remediated those, you'll want to create a plan of continual monitoring to ensure that as things are updated and such, there isn't there aren't findings that pop up. You should do that based off of a risk score, which your team should create based on factors that are important to your organization, as well as the willingness of the vendor to make fixes and their general accessibility level and how long it's taken them to become accessible. So you should re-audit at things like renewal, major product updates and such, anytime that you're bringing on a vendor, there should be some sort of audit that helps support their accessibility level. And expect and plan for non-conformance, involve relevant stakeholders in that process, and then have a clear path for escalation in the case of breach, because likely if you have a contract provision and you're doing continuous monitoring, at some point the vendor is going to be in breach, and if they won't fix the issues, then you have to escalate. And eventually you might, no matter what you do, there might be cases where you have to terminate the contract because some vendors will underperform, and there has to be a clear process for that as well. Renewals, that's when you would actually do an accessibility audit and also bring them into your process. And I'm going to cover briefly accommodation plans and contingency plans. So accommodation plans should be made in the event that you're going to have findings and are going to be up for a while. You should have a way of getting your customers temporarily access to those services. And contingency plans, if you have to terminate, you should have another product ready to go that's more accessible. So I'm just going to skip the wrap-up and just let you know that there are resources at the end of this presentation. These slides have a number of resources. Use them. This whole community also is out there, and so you're not alone in this space. I would join the Alley Slack and ask questions. That will really help you learn more about your vendors and help create a great program. Here's my information. Feel free to reach out to me. You can reach out to me at my Navy Federal email, Jaunita_George@NavyFederal.org. Also, you can find me on LinkedIn at the URL there. It is also in the accessible version of this PowerPoint deck. And thank you.
Alley Camp 2024.